environmental case, placing humans outside and above nature, establishes a framework for exploitation, so encourage you to think differently about the environment and your relationship to it. Critiques of traditional feminism, like Judith Butler's argument, which if you want to come to lecture night, you can learn what that is. She talks about how common ways of thinking about women need to be subjected to their genealogy as a discursive construction, not merely as something that's natural based off replications of sex. And also critiques of Western thinking, for example, Orientalism. There's also a lot of these debates get played out with debates about holistic medicine versus traditional Western medicine. All of these ideas are types of thinking criticisms. Rhetoric critiques, I like these the most, focus on the specific language used by the debaters or their literature. The focus shifts from the impact of the arguments used in the debate round to the impact of words and their effect on arguments, on debaters, on the way we evaluate policies. And debaters in these type of debates are usually held accountable for the implications of their word choice for both the arguments themselves and how those implicate the debate round. Types of rhetoric case. Shanahan divides them into two types: debate-centered critiques, which focus on the effects the language has on the debaters. And the second type is argument-centered critiques, which attempt to unravel the interconnectedness between the language policymakers employ and the policies they enact. And so together, with a lot of good language case, we'll combine both of these arguments and have both impacts in the debate round. Here's a quote from Shanahan: "Using discriminatory language when making decisions increases the likelihood of engaging in discriminatory practices." A lot of his arguments trace court cases in which certain rhetoric is used to talk about particular people and the racial overtones that can result from those type of things. Types. Racial ethnic critiques. Use of the word nigger, spick, towel-headed camel jockey, or chink all have racial and ethnic language that is derogatory and can inflict harm on people. When somebody uses these words, there's evidence out there that talks about why these words should not be used and the impact that they have on people, the impact that they have when used in an academic environment, when used in a competitive environment, what they do to the speaking subject. And there's also forms of political language case, terrorist discourse, things like calling people a terrorist has certain implications. You'll learn a lot about these. One of the other varsity lab, Mark's lab, is doing a list about an argument about how Cuba should be removed from the terrorist list. And I guarantee you one of the modules will be that calling people terrorists is unethical. There's also types of arguments that talk about techno-strategic discourse. For example, what I talked about earlier, the word daisy cutter, weapon, or WMD is used to sanitize these type of arguments. For example, when we refer to things as collateral damage, what that really means is that's a fancy word for saying we killed a bunch of civilians or we blew up a bunch of things that we weren't supposed to. And so there's a lot of evidence out there that talks about its relationship to the media, what it does to people when we talk about these type of things. Herbert Marcuse talks about operationalist discourse, and that's kind of along the same lines of the collateral damage type things. Andrew Robinson argues that before war ever happens, it must be established so in language. And behind every action, before somebody ever pushes the finger on a big nuclear button, there are human actions and a system of language that has created militarism that allows for those type of things to happen. And so if we change our language or the way we talk about war, then we won't have war. Additionally, gendered language such as mankind, or earlier when Mark referred to, I can't remember what it was, we said everybody was you guys.
Yeah, judges.
Yeah, we had he judges. When he assumed that all judges in NPDA were he's, that's a gendered statement because we have people that self-identify as women in the parlor field. He also caught himself very quickly, which I applaud him for. Words like you guys are common terms that refer to groups of people that may not self-identify as guys. Words like faggot are derogatory language that's used to discriminate against people who have a certain gender identity. All of these arguments, there's also answers to a lot of these. In fact, Butler talks about how some of these arguments can be redeployed. It doesn't mean that, her argument is that words are just norms and they only have meaning because we've given them meaning. And so if we would like to take those words as an empty shell and redefine them and redeploy them to be something different, then we can do that. And so injurious language, what used to be considered injurious language, can become something completely different, because only humans can give words meaning. Third type of K that I was talking about are value criticisms. Value Ks reveal the critical underlying value assumptions and expose them to either external or internal standards. So the two types of standards we have. First is the external standards. They're typically found in some societal or cultural ideal and applied from the outside. Rather than accept the underlying value structure, this variation of the critique rejects critical elements of that structure, rendering it unable to support itself. The second type of standard is the internal standard, which use the revealed value assumptions to expose inherent contradictions and inconsistencies within policy structures. These Ks try to delegitimize the dominant views of society by showing how they fail to meet their own standards of legitimacy. Types of value Ks. Rejecting a policy and refusing to present an alternative drastically alters the debate's policy framework, which relies almost exclusively on comparing policy alternatives. We can talk about the word should and where that assumption comes from in a second. But when the foundation cracks, people get nervous. When the walls crumble, they get scared and angry. CLS authors, which just means critical legal studies, have probably been one of the first types of critiques that were argued in the earlier 80s because of the topics that they had at the time just kind of work well with them. Additionally, Nietzsche arguments. A lot of alternative debates here come down to doing nothing, and these type of arguments make it really hard to compare policy options when somebody is essentially saying everything in the status quo that you're defending or replicating is bad, but I'm going to defend the status quo, or not doing anything. But these authors will also argue that when faced with the choice between doing something and doing nothing becomes a choice that's different from, I guess, the status quo. So thinking behind policy decisions toward value assumptions in any fashion helps uncover much about the way those decisions are accomplished. You can also talk a lot more about how, in an easier sense, about how certain value assumptions inform policy decisions. For example, I guarantee you if you ask Bush about whether or not values inform his political decisions, he'll talk about how his Christian ethics inform his decisions. Values can be many shapes, colors, and fashions. So the way, uncovering the value structure of an argument will give you a large idea of how that policy argument is justified and how it goes down. And some people argue that the values behind your policy are just as important, if not more important, than the policy decision itself. So, things that I think are annoying about critiques. When you say arguments like, they use the state, and the state is totally, like, bad. That's not a good argument to me. I think that those type of arguments need to be a lot more complete. There are ways of running state-based criticisms that are a lot more in-depth, that are a lot more specific to the topic, and I think you need to take advantage of those. And additionally, here's another one. I think this is a quote from, I can't remember who it was a quote from, but I think it's pretty evident there is a link to capitalism here, Judge. Moving on. Those type of things are really annoying. You should not assume links to critical arguments. You should not just think that, well, they talk about the economy a little bit, so I've got a link to my cap argument. You need to have specific arguments and specific link arguments, nuanced link arguments that apply to the plan text, advantages, anything like that, that will make that argument more persuasive. Every year there are tons of new things that become subjects of criticism. Learn new things to talk about. Get out of your familiar state and cap arguments, which are those are the two that I see predominantly used in debate rounds that I've seen so far. Another thing that's really annoying is pre-fiat and post-fiat. Please stop saying this. I have no idea what this means. Of all my years of debating critiques, I have no idea what this arbitrary sequencing of arguments means, and it's only done more damage to confuse people than it really ever did to help people talk about them. The argument pre-fiat and post-fiat is that there's certain arguments that should be sequenced before we talk about other arguments like fiat. And so this is a over-glorified way of saying the critique is an a priori issue. Say that. Don't say that it comes before or after, because usually these arguments and the way